The rain pelted against the window like tiny fists, echoing the turmoil inside my chest. I stared at my phone, the message from my mother glowing accusingly in the darkness of my apartment. Olivia needs your help. Financial emergency. Please call. My thumb hovered over the delete button. 3 years of silence, and now this? My name is Margot Harlow, and I've spent half my life in the shadow of my perfect younger sister. Growing up, Olivia was the golden child, the miracle baby born after my mother was told she couldn't have more children. While I was gangly and awkward with wild curls that refused to be tamed, Olivia emerged into the world with porcelain skin and docile blonde hair that fell in perfect waves down her back. I used to think the universe had a cruel sense of humor, making me the dark-haired, sharp-edged firstborn who could never quite measure up to the dainty, angelic afterthought. I took another sip of wine and read the message again. The old familiar ache spread through my chest, the wound that never quite healed. We're desperate. That last bit was new. In all my 29 years, I'd never known my mother to admit desperation. She was always perfect, composed, in control, just like Olivia. My phone buzzed again. My sister's name appeared on the screen, and my stomach clenched. Please, Margot. I know you hate me, but Mom and Dad are about to lose everything. I laughed bitterly. Hate her? If only it were that simple. The truth was, I'd spent my entire childhood desperately loving a family that had always seen me as the understudy, the rough draft, the almost but not quite. The memories rushed back with startling clarity. My high school graduation, when they'd left early because 15-year-old Olivia had a dance recital. My first art exhibition in college, which they'd missed entirely because Olivia had broken up with her boyfriend and needed family support. The countless achievements that went unacknowledged while Olivia's every minor accomplishment was celebrated with dinners and gifts and Facebook posts full of pride. 3 years ago, I'd finally had enough. After spending months helping my parents plan Olivia's wedding, a lavish affair that drained their savings, I'd made the mistake of announcing my own engagement the week after. My mother's response still echoed in my ears. Oh, honey, we just can't afford another wedding right now. Besides, don't you think you should wait? You've only known Russell for 2 years. Olivia and David have been together since high school. The fact that David had cheated on Olivia twice during that time apparently didn't factor into her assessment. That night, I'd packed my things and walked out, Russell's hand in mine. We'd moved to Chicago, gotten married at the courthouse with only his family present, and built a life 300 miles away from the toxic cycle I'd finally escaped. And now they needed me. My phone buzzed again. A voice message this time. I pressed play before I could stop myself. Margot. My father's voice, usually so confident and booming, sounded frail and distant. I know we haven't been. I know things haven't been good between us. But we're in real trouble here. The business is failing. We might lose the house. Please, just call us back. I closed my eyes, letting the message sink in. My father's construction company had been successful for decades. What could have happened? The click of the apartment door broke my reverie. Russell walked in, shaking rain from his coat and smiling when he saw me. Hey, you, he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. Why are you sitting in the dark? I handed him my phone wordlessly. He read the messages, his expression darkening. After 3 years, this is what they lead with, he said, his voice tight with protective anger. No apology, just a financial emergency? My dad left a message, I said quietly. He sounds broken. Russell sat beside me, taking my hands in his. "What do you want to do?" That was the thing about Russell. He never told me how to feel about my family. Never pushed me to reconcile, never demanded I cut them off entirely. He simply stood by me, a steady lighthouse in the storm of my complicated family dynamics. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to ignore them, to let them figure it out themselves. But they're still your family," he finished softly. "And despite everything, you still care." I nodded, tears welling up unexpectedly. "Does that make me pathetic?" "It makes you compassionate," Russell said firmly. "Which is just one of the many reasons I love you." He pulled me into his arms, and I breathed in the familiar scent of his cologne, letting it ground me as I contemplated what to do next. "You know," he added carefully, "we're in a good place financially. If you wanted to help them without actually having to see them." I pulled back, shaking my head. "No. If I'm going to do this, I need to understand what happened. How they went from stable to desperate in 3 years." I took a deep breath. "I think I need to go back to Millfield." Russell's brow furrowed with concern. "Want me to come with you?" The offer tempted me. Having Russell by my side would make facing my family infinitely easier. But I knew his architectural firm was in the middle of a major project. "No, you need to finish the Peterson building design," I said. "I'll be okay. It's just a few days." "Are you sure?" The truth was, I wasn't sure of anything. But I nodded anyway, my decision made. I would go back to my hometown, face the family that had always made me feel secondary, and figure out what had gone so catastrophically wrong. I just hoped I could do it without losing myself in the process. The 3-hour drive from Chicago to Millfield stretched before me like a journey into the past. Each mile marker seemed to peel away a layer of the woman I'd become, revealing the insecure girl I'd fought so hard to leave behind. I'd called my mother that morning, giving her just enough notice to ensure they'd be home when I arrived, but not enough time for them to prepare some elaborate charade. Her relief had been palpable, making me wonder just how dire their situation really was. As I pulled into the familiar driveway of my childhood home, I was struck by how much smaller it looked. The once pristine white colonial with its manicured lawn now seemed tired. Paint peeled from the shutters, and the garden my mother had once tended with religious devotion was overgrown with weeds. Before I could gather my courage to exit the car, the front door flew open. Olivia burst out, her golden hair now cut into a practical bob, her face thinner than I remembered but still annoyingly perfect. "Margot," she cried, rushing toward me as I reluctantly stepped from the car. "I can't believe you came." She threw her arms around me, and I stood stiffly in her embrace, unsure how to respond. Up close, I could see the dark circles under her eyes, poorly concealed with makeup, and the worry lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago. "Hi, Olivia," I said, gently disentangling myself. "You look different." She gave a hollow laugh. 3 years and a divorce will do that." My eyebrows shot up. "You and David are divorced?" "Going on a year now," she said with forced lightness. "Turns out the 3rd time he cheated was the charm." Despite everything, a rush of sympathy coursed through me. "I'm sorry to hear that." She shrugged, the gesture so uncharacteristically casual for my usually poised sister that it surprised me. "Don't be." "Best decision I ever made." "Come on, Mom and Dad are waiting." As we walked toward the house, I couldn't help but notice the lack of a car in her usual spot. "Did you walk here?" "Oh, I live here now," she said dismissively. After the divorce, well, it just made sense financially. The picture was becoming clearer, pieces falling into place. My sister's failed marriage. My father's business troubles. Something had gone very wrong with the Harlow family finances. My parents stood in the doorway, looking like aged versions of themselves. My mother, Patricia, had always been meticulously put together, but now her clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her once perfectly dyed brown hair showed significant streaks of gray. My father, Robert, seemed to have shrunk, his broad shoulders now hunched with the weight of whatever burden they were carrying. "Margot," my mother breathed, reaching for me. "You came." I allowed her brief hug, noting how fragile she felt in my arms. "You said it was an emergency." My father cleared his throat. "It is. Thank you for coming, sweetheart." The endearment, so rarely directed at me in my childhood, felt strange now. I gave a curt nod, following them into the house. The interior was as neglected as the exterior. The furniture, once obsessively maintained, showed signs of wear. The living room walls, which had once displayed a strategic selection of family photos, mostly featuring Olivia's achievements, were now oddly bare, with darker rectangles of paint where frames had once hung. "Have you sold off the family photos?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. My mother looked away. "Just the frames." They were silver. The admission hung in the air, a stark testament to how far things had fallen. "Maybe we should sit down," my father suggested, gesturing toward the dining room. Around the table, with coffee cups steaming before us, my father finally began to explain. "About 2 years ago, things started getting tight at the company. The new housing development on the east side fell through after we'd already invested in materials. Then the pandemic hit, and projects dried up." I nodded. This much made sense. The construction industry had been hit hard. "We thought it was temporary," my mother chimed in. "We took out a second mortgage to keep things afloat." My father's eyes dropped to his cup. Then Olivia's divorce happened. David left her with nothing but debt. I glanced at my sister, who was studying her fingernails intently. "What kind of debt?" I asked. "Credit cards, mostly," she admitted. "And a loan for his truck. He put everything in my name because his credit was bad. Then he emptied our joint account and disappeared." The familiar pattern of my family protecting Olivia at all costs emerged. "And let me guess, Mom and Dad paid it all off for you?" My mother's expression hardened. "She's our daughter. She needed help." "So am I said quietly, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I'm your daughter too." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. My father cleared his throat again. "The point is, between the business losses, the second mortgage, and helping Olivia get back on her feet, we're drowning. The bank is threatening foreclosure on the house. The business is weeks away from bankruptcy. We've sold everything of value." "Almost everything," my mother corrected, her hand moving unconsciously to her bare neck where her diamond pendant, a 30th anniversary gift from my father, used to hang. I took a deep breath, pushing aside the hurt and resentment that threatened to overwhelm me. "How much do you need to keep the house?" They exchanged glances. "50,000 to get current on the mortgage and pay off the most pressing business debts," my father said eventually. "But Margot, we're not asking for a handout. We have a proposal." I raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Your art," my mother said hesitantly. "Olivia mentioned you've been quite successful lately." I couldn't hide my surprise as I turned to my sister. "You've been following my career?" She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I follow your gallery on Instagram." Those murals you did for the Chicago Children's Museum were amazing. The compliment caught me off guard. I'd never heard a word of praise for my art from my family before. My decision to pursue a fine arts degree instead of something practical had been met with disappointment and concern. We were hoping, my father continued, that maybe you could commission a few pieces for some of my old business contacts. High-end clients who might be interested in original artwork. If you could just help us make those connections. I sat back, stunned. They weren't asking for money, they were asking for my professional help. They were acknowledging, perhaps for the first time, that my career had value. I'd need to see the business financials, I said slowly. And I'd want Russell to look them over. He's good with numbers. My father nodded eagerly. Of course. Anything you need. And I'm not promising anything, I warned. I'll need to think about it. We understand, my mother said quickly. We're just grateful you're willing to consider it. As the conversation wound down, Olivia offered to show me to my old room. We walked up the stairs in awkward silence, the weight of 3 years of estrangement between us. It's pretty much how you left it, she said as she pushed open the door. Mom couldn't bring herself to change anything. I stepped into the time capsule of my teenage years. The walls still displayed my early artwork, pieces I'd been proud of at 16 but now recognized as amateurish. The twin bed with its faded purple comforter. The desk where I'd spent countless hours drawing, dreaming of escape. Thank you for coming, Olivia said softly. I know it couldn't have been easy. I turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time. Without the filter of childhood jealousy and hurt, I could see the toll the last few years had taken. My perfect sister didn't look so perfect anymore. What happened with David? I asked. The real story. She sank onto the edge of my bed, suddenly looking exhausted. The real story is that I married a manipulative narcissist who saw me as a trophy and a meal ticket. He cheated, he lied, he spent money we didn't have, and when I finally called him on it, he left me drowning in debt and moved in with his 22-year-old secretary. That sounds familiar, I muttered before I could stop myself. Olivia looked up sharply. What does that mean? The dam broke. It means, I said, my voice rising, that our entire childhood, you were the golden child who could do no wrong. I was pushed aside, ignored, dismissed, while you got every opportunity, every advantage, every ounce of their love and attention. And now you're acting surprised that you married someone who treated you exactly the way our parents treated me. Olivia's face went pale. Is that really how you see it? How you see me? How else am I supposed to see it? I demanded. Name one time, just one, when they put me first. When my needs, my accomplishments, my dreams mattered as much as yours. That's not fair, she protested weakly. Isn't it? My high school graduation, you had a dance recital, so they left early. My college art show, you had boy troubles, so they skipped it entirely. My engagement, you just had a wedding, so they couldn't possibly support mine. Tears welled in her eyes. I never asked them to do those things. I never wanted to overshadow you. Didn't you? I challenged. You always had to be the center of attention. Perfect little Olivia with her perfect grades and perfect extracurriculars and perfect boyfriends. Perfect? She gave a humorless laugh. Is that what you thought? God, Margot, I was killing myself trying to be what they wanted. Do you have any idea what it's like to be the miracle child? The one they never thought they'd have? The expectations were suffocating. I faltered, thrown by her outburst. You got to be yourself, she continued, tears flowing freely now. You pursued your passions. You found a man who actually loves you for who you are. I spent 25 years being what everyone else wanted, and look where it got me. Divorced, broke, living with my parents, and resented by the sister I've always admired. Her words hung in the air between us, reshaping the narrative I'd held onto for so long. Admired? She'd admired me? I'm going to unpack, I said finally, unable to process this new information. I'll see you at dinner. She nodded, wiping her tears as she stood. At the door, she paused. For what it's worth, I really am sorry, Margot. For everything. As the door closed behind her, I sank onto the bed, my worldview tilting on its axis. The golden child had feet of clay after all. I wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. Dinner that night was a strained affair. We danced around the subject of money, instead discussing safe topics like the weather and my drive from Chicago. My mother had prepared my childhood favorite, lasagna, in what I recognized as a peace offering. Russell called, I mentioned as we cleared the plates. He's going to drive up this weekend to look at the business financials. My father's relief was evident. That's very kind of him. Please thank him for us. He's doing it for me, I said pointedly. Not for you. My mother flinched at the barb, but she didn't argue. The new subdued version of Patricia Harlow was disconcerting. Where was the woman who'd always had a ready correction for my posture, my clothes, my life choices? After dinner, I excused myself to call Russell. Sitting on the porch swing that had witnessed so many teenage heartbreaks and dreams, I filled him in on what I'd learned. So, they're banking on your art connections to save them? He asked, a note of skepticism in his voice. Apparently. Though I'm not sure they realize how unlikely it is that my clients would want to invest in a failing construction business. It's interesting that they're turning to you, though, Russell mused. After all this time. Maybe they've finally realized what they lost when you walked away. I sighed, watching a firefly blink in the gathering darkness. Maybe. Or maybe they're just desperate enough to try anything, even asking the disappointment daughter for help. Hey, Russell's voice sharpened. You were never a disappointment. They just couldn't see your value. His unwavering belief in me was like a warm blanket, comforting even from 300 miles away. I know. It's just hard being back here. It brings up all those old feelings. That's understandable. But don't let them pull you back into old patterns, okay? You're not that insecure girl anymore. You're Margot Harlow, successful artist and the love of my life. I smiled despite myself. I miss you. Miss you too. I'll be there Friday night. Think you can survive till then? I'll try, I promised. Love you. Love you more. As I ended the call, I noticed Olivia standing in the doorway, an unreadable expression on her face. Sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I just came to see if you wanted some coffee. It's fine, I said, though it wasn't. How much had she heard? She handed me a steaming mug, black, the way I'd always taken it, and settled beside me on the swing, her own cup cradled in her hands. You and Russell seem happy, she observed after a moment. We are. There was no point denying it. I'm glad. You deserve that. The sincerity in her voice surprised me. We sat in silence for a while, the gentle creak of the swing filling the space between us. Can I ask you something? She said finally. And will you promise not to get angry? I steeled myself. I can't promise that, but you can ask. She took a deep breath. Why did you never tell me how you felt? About me being the favorite, I mean. All those years, and you never once said anything. The question caught me off guard. Would it have mattered if I had? Of course it would have, she exclaimed. Margot, I idolized you. You were so talented and independent and brave. Everything I wasn't allowed to be. I stared at her, struggling to reconcile this version of our childhood with the one I'd carried for so long. That's not how I remember it. Of course not. You were too busy seeing what you thought was favoritism to notice the prison of expectations I was living in. Every time I tried to be like you, to pursue my own interests or speak my own mind, I was reminded that I needed to be sensible and practical. That I couldn't afford to make mistakes because I was the miracle baby. So, what? I challenged. You're saying they didn't favor you over me? That I imagined 20 years of being sidelined for your ballet recitals and soccer games? No, she said quietly. I'm saying it wasn't as simple as you think. They put all their hopes and dreams on me, which meant controlling every aspect of my life. You got freedom. I got a gilded cage. The metaphor struck me. I'd never considered that being the golden child might have come with its own set of burdens. Had I been so consumed by my own hurt that I'd missed Olivia's? If it was so terrible being the favorite, I said finally, why did you go along with it? Why play into their expectations? She stared into her coffee cup. Because I was scared. Scared of disappointing them. Scared of failing. Scared of ending up alone. She gave a bitter laugh. Lot of good it did me. I still ended up divorced, broke, and living with my parents at 26. I didn't know what to say to that. The script I'd been following my entire life, Olivia as the antagonist, the usurper of parental love, was being rewritten before my eyes. I should get to bed, I said, standing abruptly. It's been a long day. Olivia nodded, making no move to stop me. Good night, Margot. As I walked up the stairs to my childhood bedroom, my thoughts were in turmoil. Had I been wrong all these years? Was Olivia a victim in her own way? And more importantly, did it change anything about what I was willing to do for this family that had caused me so much pain? The next morning, I found my father in his study, surrounded by piles of paperwork. The bags under his eyes suggested he'd been there all night. Dad? I called softly. Can I talk to you for a minute? He looked up, blinking as if emerging from a trance. Margot. Of course, come in. He shuffled some papers, making room for me to sit across from him. I've been thinking about your proposal, I began, choosing my words carefully. About using my art connections to help save the business. Hope flickered in his tired eyes. Yes? I don't think it's going to work, I said bluntly. His shoulders slumped. I see. The problem is, the people who buy my art aren't necessarily looking to invest in construction companies. They're art collectors, not venture capitalists. He nodded resignedly. I understand. It was a long shot anyway. But, I continued, I might have another idea. He looked up, curious. My gallery is opening a second location in Detroit. They're looking for a contractor to renovate the space. It's a big job, the building is over 100 years old and needs significant work. His eyes widened. You'd recommend us for that? If your financials check out, I qualified. I need to be sure that taking on a project this size wouldn't just lead to more trouble. But if Russell looks at the books and thinks it's viable, then yes, I'd be willing to put in a good word. Margot, that's incredibly generous, he stammered. I'm not doing it to be generous, I said firmly. I'm doing it because despite everything, you're my father, and I don't want to see you bankrupt. He flinched at my coldness but nodded. Fair enough. I'll get the books ready for Russell to review. I stood to leave, but his voice stopped me. Margot, I know words aren't enough, but I am truly sorry. For all of it. For making you feel less important, less loved. It was never intentional, but that doesn't make it any less wrong. The apology, so unexpected and so long overdue, lodged in my throat. Why now? I managed to ask. After all these years, why are you only acknowledging this now? He ran a hand through his thinning hair. Because losing everything has a way of making you reassess your priorities. I've had a lot of time to think about what really matters. And I've realized that chasing financial success and projecting the perfect family image cost me my relationship with my eldest daughter. I swallowed hard. It wasn't just about the perfect image. It was about the constant comparison. The way you and Mom always made me feel like I was never quite good enough, while Olivia could do no wrong. I know, he said heavily. And what's worse is that in trying to protect Olivia from any hardship or disappointment, we may have inadvertently set her up for failure. Her divorce, the financial mess she's in, perhaps if we'd let her face consequences earlier in life, she might have made better choices. The admission stunned me. I'd never expected my father, who had always been so certain of his parenting approach, to express regret or take responsibility. I don't expect you to forgive us overnight, he continued. Or maybe ever. But I want you to know that I'm proud of the woman you've become, Margot. You built a successful career and a happy marriage without our support, and that shows a strength of character that I wish I'd recognized sooner. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I blinked them back furiously. I need to make some calls about the gallery project, I said, my voice slightly unsteady. I'll let you know what they say. He nodded, understanding my need to retreat. Thank you, Margot. For everything. As I walked back to my room, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of a path toward it. That afternoon, I drove to the construction company office to get a first-hand look at the state of the business. The once bustling headquarters was eerily quiet, with only a skeleton crew manning the phones and managing ongoing projects. The business manager, Helen, who had known me since I was a child, greeted me with a warm hug. Margot. Your dad mentioned you might stop by. It's so good to see you. It's good to see you too, Helen, I said sincerely. Though I wish it were under better circumstances. How bad is it really? Her smile faltered. Bad. We're down to about a quarter of our usual projects. Had to let most of the crew go. Your dad's been working for free for months, trying to keep things afloat. The information surprised me. My father, always so proud and ambitious, working without pay to save his employees' jobs? That didn't align with the image of the ruthless businessman who had prioritized success over his daughter's emotional needs. He never mentioned that, I said. Helen's expression softened. He wouldn't. He's too proud. But he's been taking the hardest hit to protect the rest of us. Even mortgaged the house to make payroll last year. The sacrifice moved me more than I wanted to admit. Is there any chance of recovery? If a big project came through? There's always a chance, Helen said cautiously. We've got the skills and equipment. Just need the opportunity to prove ourselves again. I nodded thoughtfully. I might have something in the works. A gallery renovation in Detroit. Helen's eyes lit up. That would be a lifeline, Margot. Truly. As I left the office, my phone buzzed with a text from the gallery owner. Just got your message. Intrigued by your father's company. Can we set up a meeting next week? I texted back a quick affirmative, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. By helping my father save his business, was I enabling the same family dynamics that had hurt me? Or was I rising above the past, offering forgiveness that might not be deserved but was within my power to give? I didn't have answers yet, but for the first time, I was willing to consider that the narrative I'd constructed about my family might not be the whole story. Back at the house, I found my mother in the kitchen, preparing dinner with an intensity that suggested she was using the task to avoid thinking about their precarious situation. Need help? I offered, surprising myself. She looked up, equally surprised. That would be nice. Could you chop the peppers? We worked in companionable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of cooking together bringing back memories of rare peaceful moments from my childhood. Your father told me about your offer, she said eventually. The gallery project. I nodded, focusing on the pepper beneath my knife. It's not a done deal yet. Just a possibility. Still, it's more than we deserve from you. The frank admission made me look up. My mother's eyes were suspiciously bright as she continued. I know we failed you, Margot. I've had a lot of time to reflect on my parenting choices, and I can see now how much pain we caused you. I set down the knife, not trusting myself to use it while this conversation was happening. Why, Mom? Why was it always Olivia first? She sighed deeply. It's complicated. After I had you, there were complications. The doctors said I'd never have another child. I threw myself into being the perfect mother to you, but then I got pregnant with Olivia when you were 3. It felt like a miracle. So, she was special, and I was just ordinary, I said, the old hurt creeping into my voice. No, my mother exclaimed. No, that's not it at all. You were my first miracle. My beautiful, talented, independent girl. But Olivia was fragile from birth, premature, underweight. The doctors weren't sure she'd survive. This was news to me. I never knew that. We didn't tell you. You were just a child yourself. But those first few months, watching her struggle to breathe in the NICU, it changed me. I became obsessed with protecting her, making sure she had every advantage. She wiped away a tear. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that you needed protection too. That you needed to be seen and valued for who you were, not just what you could achieve on your own. The revelation stunned me. All these years, I'd assumed my parents favored Olivia simply because she was prettier, more compliant, more like them. I'd never considered that there might be a deeper, more complex history at play. That doesn't make it okay, I said, but the edge had gone out of my voice. No, it doesn't, my mother agreed. Nothing excuses how we made you feel. I'm just trying to explain, not justify. She reached for my hand across the counter. I'm so sorry, Margot. For everything. For not seeing you. For not celebrating you. For making you feel like you had to leave to be valued. Her touch was tentative, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. For the first time in years, I allowed my mother to hold my hand as we both shed tears for what might have been. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, I said honestly. But I'm trying to understand. She nodded, squeezing my hand gently before releasing it. That's more than we have any right to ask for. As we finished preparing dinner, a new, fragile understanding hummed between us. Not reconciliation, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of healing. That night, as I lay in my childhood bed, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, I realized something important. The family that had hurt me so deeply was still my family. Flawed, complicated, sometimes cruel in their blindness, but also capable of growth, of change, of remorse. And maybe, just maybe, so was I. Russell arrived Friday evening, his presence like a breath of fresh air in the stifling atmosphere of my family home. I'd never been more grateful for his steady, grounding influence as we navigated the awkward family dinner. Afterward, my father presented the business financials, spreading them across the dining table for Russell's review. As an architect, Russell had a keen eye for construction costs and project management challenges. "You've been operating at a loss for almost 2 years," he observed, frowning as he studied the numbers. "But your fundamental business model is still sound. The issue seems to be cash flow and a lack of major projects." My father nodded grimly. "The pandemic hit us hard, and then the reputation damage from the failed development made it difficult to secure new clients." Russell looked at me, his expression carefully neutral. He wouldn't push me either way, I knew. This decision was mine alone. "If the gallery project comes through," I said slowly, "would it be enough to turn things around?" "Potentially," Russell answered. "It would provide immediate cash flow and could serve as a showcase for future clients. But it's a big if. And there's no guarantee it would solve the long-term issues." I took a deep breath, then made the call I'd been postponing. Putting my phone on speaker, I dialed my gallery owner. "Margot. I was just thinking about you," Sandra's cheerful voice filled the room. "Have you had a chance to talk to your father about the Detroit project?" "Actually, he's sitting right here," I said. "Along with my husband, who's reviewed the financials. We wanted to discuss some specifics." As Sandra and my father discussed the details of the gallery renovation, I watched the faces around the table. My mother's anxious hope. Olivia's quiet attentiveness. Russell's supportive presence. "This could work," Sandra concluded after 20 minutes. "Robert, if you can send me those portfolios of your previous historical renovations, I think we have a deal." When the call ended, the relief in the room was palpable. It wasn't a guaranteed salvation, but it was a lifeline, a chance for my father's company to rebuild. "Thank you, Margot," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." "This isn't about repayment," I replied. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult." That night, as Russell and I packed to return to Chicago, Olivia knocked on my door. "So you're leaving tomorrow?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. I nodded. "We have lives to get back to." She hesitated. Will you come back sometimes?" The question hung between us, not just about visits, but about whether this fragile reconnection could survive. "I think so," I said carefully. "Not like before. Things can't go back to how they were. But maybe we can build something new." "I'd like that," she said softly. "I've missed my big sister." In the morning, as we said our goodbyes, my mother pressed a small package into my hands. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it when you get home," she whispered. The drive back to Chicago felt lighter somehow. Not because all was forgiven, it wasn't, not yet, but because I'd confronted my past and found myself stronger than its shadows. At home, I finally opened my mother's package. Inside was a childhood drawing I'd made, a family portrait showing all 4 of us holding hands under a rainbow. On the back, my mother had written, "You were always the glue that held us together, even when we were too blind to see it." Thank you for giving us a second chance we didn't deserve. I traced my childish drawing with my fingertips, tears blurring my vision. The golden child might have been their miracle, but I had become my own salvation. And in saving myself, I'd found the strength to offer them a path to redemption too. Not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't walking away, it's coming back on your own terms.